really good at it. Anyway, Bill is going to talk, and Bill's flying in the door right now, and we've missed him for quite some time, but here he is.
Thank you. First of all, I want to compliment Jean because many of you know this. This organization, this club, descended from Bob Feaster. Is that his name?
Bob Allen.
Bob
Allen.
Bob Allen. Do any of you remember Bob? He ran something that existed in that took place at the Bellevue Y. It obviously ceased to exist during COVID, and Gene and I were discussing how to bring it back. And at that time, I didn't have a lot going on in my life. Like, I had a job, but not much else. But so when we kind of agreed to bring this back, it looked like it would be like a 50-50 thing. No, it's been like a 99-1 thing. She's done everything.
But you're here.
And but I'm here. But the point is, we can thank Jean that this organization exists. And hasn't she done a great job? But to give you an idea of how busy I am, I still have a full-time job. And yesterday at this time, I was taking my son to the airport because he graduated from college last week. And I just got news as I was driving here that they have arrived in Santiago, Chile. And they're going to spend 4 days at Easter Island. Dang, these young people. I've never been there. Anyway, so my presentation today is about something that has hardly ever been written about in any Tennessee history book. But if you look at old newspapers, you will see occasional ads for these places. And this is a non-controversial topic. I've spoken about slavery and the civil rights movement. Sometimes people leave mad. Well, they're not going to leave mad here, okay? Before Airbnb, before state parks, before people had cars, our great-great-grandparents vacationed at the resort hotel in the next county. They vacationed at these resort hotels for weeks or months at a time. They drink mineral water, relax, read, write letters, sleep, take a dip, fish, play croquet, pool, tennis, and what was then called 10 pins is now called bowling. They take naps. At night, they listen to orchestras and dance, and in some cases, sip homemade whiskey. They'd have big breakfasts in the morning and fried chicken dinners in the late afternoon. And there's a lot of newspaper articles I'll show, but this is a picture of one that used to be at Mont Eagle. This picture is of what it was at one time the largest resort hotel in Tennessee. It is in Granger County, which now has a total of 40 hotel rooms. This hotel had 400 rooms. It was called the Tate Springs Hotel. From about 1820 until about 1930, Tennessee had somewhere in the range of 95 resort hotels, which came and went. Some of them lasted for generations. They ranged from 30-room mom and pops to 200-room corporate-owned monstrosities with golf courses, bowling alleys, and full-time orchestras. They were on mountains and hilltops and in the valleys between mountains and hilltops. The vast majority of them were mineral springs. And I know that this is overwhelming, but this is a list of the hotels that I came up with during 2 months of researching this topic. But it's overwhelming, I know, but I want to point out, there are clusters here and there. But for example, there were 2 in Williamson County. And one of those is on property that is now owned by a man named Bill Lee. And when I ran to him at the grocery store, and I'm not kidding, I ran into the grocery store, I asked him, do you own the property where the Fernvale Springs Hotel used to be? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He goes, how did you know that? And I'm like, well, but one of them was on his property. The other one was called Casey Springs. There were 2 in Davidson County, one called the Fountain of Health, which is about where Interstate 40 is, and one called the White Creek Springs, which is near White Creek High School. A lot of names come from these. You might say, oh, that's where that name comes from. But the only place where they exist anymore is in Macon County. Has anyone ever been to Red Boiling Springs? When you go, are you just like dumbfounded at the sight of these things? The first time I ever drove through, I didn't know about these, and I stopped the car and just stared at this thing. I'm like, what is this? But that's the only place where they exist, and it's the only place where these hotels haven't burned down. But I will talk about these at some length. And let me start by talking about the resort hotel culture. And by the way, sometimes when I'm up here, and I'm 58, and I'm probably the youngest person in this room, right? Usually I'm the oldest person in the room by far, because I work with teachers and students. But this is the one group. Usually there's people in the room who remember this. None of you remember this. This happened before we got cars. And I used to know Senator Doug Henry, and even he wasn't old enough to remember when we didn't have cars. But anyway, what would it have been like to vacation at these resort hotels? We have a few written accounts that were published in short local histories and in newspapers. After reading and contemplating them, I will say up front that our great-grandparents wouldn't have known what to make of us today. We are, compared to them, easily bored, hyperactive, and spoiled. Every day we drive cars at high speeds, operate computers and cell phones with nearly incalculable powers, and have at our disposal thousands of episodes of television shows and sporting events. I remember specifically that my grandmother, I lived with her one summer, she told me I was hyperactive. She said, just sit down. I'm like, why? She goes, you're just driving me crazy. But I don't know if you remember your grandparents saying that to you, but that was what people thought of us. A typical vacation today, I took my family to Maine a few months ago, a couple of years ago, actually. I haven't taken a vacation. A typical vacation today might consist of a ride to the airport, a long flight to a faraway destination, a rental car, a stay in a hotel in which we don't actually meet another human being, and several long drives to and from cities or national parks, all documented by photos posted on the internet. Their vacation consisted of a slow trip to a hotel, and we'll talk about how slow in a second, which might be close or far away, where they stayed for weeks or months without going anywhere. Before I talk about the daily routine, I'll also state the obvious. In the early years, none of these hotels had electricity because it didn't exist yet. Most of them didn't have any type of centralized plumbing, which is why newer ones that came along starting in about the 1890s made a point of bragging about the fact that they did. So if people stayed up after dark in a resort hotel in 1872, they huddled by oil lamp or by candlelight. And if they had to relieve themselves, they did it in the conveniently located outhouses or even the more conveniently located chamber pots. The job of emptying these chamber pots would have fallen to either the owner of the hotel or one of his or her employees or slaves. Remember this, some of this predates the Civil War. Now that I've gotten some of the basics out of the way, let's turn our attention to some of the first-person accounts. In 1972, and believe it or not, that was 52 years ago. Wasn't 2 years ago, it was 52. A Sumner County woman named Gilbertine Moore wrote down her recollections of vacationing at Tyree Springs in her youth, which was probably between 1910 and 1920. Based on her tone, she had only very pleasant memories about the place. She describes her time at Tyree Springs as among the most wonderful experiences of her life. Moore said that most everyone who visited Tyree Springs would start the day off by drinking a large glass of black sulfur water. Has anyone here ever drinking? I have. You can drink it in Macon County now. For whatever medicinal purposes this served, quote, I joined in with most of the others in drinking a glass before breakfast and considered it a necessity ritual to vacations at Tyree Springs. That was followed, she said, by a massive breakfast which consisted of country ham, fried chicken, gravy, scrambled eggs, grits, biscuits, homemade jams, and jellies. As for how she spent most of the rest of the morning, Moore describes it in this manner. The pleasures I sought were not hard to find because they were everywhere, trees and birds and flowers and sky to look at, little streams to wade in, walks along wooded paths, and sometimes a trip to the little store at the foot of the hill. In the afternoon, they were pretty much the same as in my morning, with the added pleasure of an occasional walk to a cave which was located on a farm joining the Tyree property. She goes on to describe walking with her dog, carving a walking cane, staying up late listening to her father and other men tell stories about, quote, their exploits in younger days of adventures with snakes and owls and baits and the Bell Witch. It was uncanny, but almost without exception, the scarier the tale got, the louder the screech oil down in the hollow would let out an eerie shriek. And by the way, in Sumner County today, no one exactly knows where these hotels were. This is one of many. There's a historic marker and it says somewhere in this area. And that's true with many of them. About the time Gilbertine Moore's family vacationed at Tyree Springs, Martha Lindsay's family would head to Beersheba Springs. Her recollections were written down in a book called Beersheba Springs, A History. These were idyllic days for me, she said, and no one ever said to me, why don't you go outside and play? It's such a nice day. I could spend as much time as I wanted reading on the porch swing, a marvelous construction long enough for me to lie down, with high railings around three sides and mattresses and pillows. On rainy days, I would go into the living room and lying flat on my stomach on the floor, I would read something from the collection of the bookshelves. My first introduction to Shakespeare was by way of King Lear, chosen for what reason I cannot imagine from a full set of Shakespeare paper mounts. Have any of you ever been to Hot Springs, Arkansas? I did last year. It's the most dog-friendly place on the planet. You bring your dog, but there's some version of the culture still there. And this is a sign that I took there, and it talks about how women would dress up to walk. And I know that's true because every picture I have that I've found of people hiking in like the 1920s, they're wearing ties, you know. Finally, a word about race in resort hotels. Tennessee's resort hotels existed from 1810 until about 1850. 1950. Prior to 1865, many of their guests would have been slaveholders. After 1865, their guests would have been white people in the segregated South. Also, at the time, the Tennessee Constitution forbade interracial marriage, interracial education, and state law required public transportation to provide separate accommodations for white and black riders. It would have been illegal for these resort hotels to have allowed African American guests to stay under the same roof as white guests, and even more unheard of for the black guests to be served at the same table. And here's an example of one of the many ads I found. But make no mistake, the culture of the resort hotel of yesteryear was not an integrated culture. Here are some of the many examples I found in news clippings and literature. In 1917, Knox County's Whittle Springs Hotel ran a classified ad, this classified ad, that said, we're just looking for white waitresses. Also, in many of the newspaper ads for resort hotels before and after the Civil War, the references to special rates for servants and slaves. And the Tate Springs Hotel booklet, printed in 1940, says that the hotel has special rates for, quote, children under 5 years of age and colored servants. And anyway, so I just want to point this out. It's kind of the elephant in the room. Anyway, I'm going to talk about some of the earliest resort hotels here. And by the way, some of the better pictures that I found are in the McClung collection at the University of Tennessee, and others are at the State Library. It's funny that I should just drink a glass of water because of the next line. It's safe to say that Americans don't think much about natural springs anymore. We're so used to getting fresh, safe water out of the tap. But our ancestors did. No sooner had they migrated west across the mountains and they started looking for springs. If they found a spring on their land, they often gave their land a title like Marble Springs, White Oak Springs, or Dixon Springs to ensure that their land was labeled with a fresh water source. If you look up early land advertisements in Tennessee, many reference springs that could be found on their property. Natural springs determine the locations of many of Tennessee's early towns, such as Greenville, Rogersville, and Springfield. Nashville is where it is today because of a spring in Salt Lick a few hundred feet from the Cumberland River, where the Bicentennial Capitol Mall now sits. However, there is a difference between a sweet spring that produces fresh water, maybe this water, right? No, this is purified water. And a mineral spring that produces special types of water that people thought could cure diseases. Some mineral springs produce chalybeate. Am I pronouncing that right? Y'all remember that name, that word? It was a word that everyone knew the meaning of before like 1950. Chalybeate, Chalybbeate. It was in all these ads. And water, chalybeate water, which contains far more iron than the water people normally drink today. Then there are sulfur springs, which have a recognizable odor that most people find offensive, and alum springs, which produce a third type of water. The famous mineral springs at Granger County's Tate Springs Resort featured Epsom water, which is water that features more magnesium sulfate in it than normal water. I have a feeling there's a geologist in the room who knows more about this than I do. Tennessee's first commercial spring was the and this is as best I could tell looking at old newspapers. Tennessee's first commercial spring was the Robertson Sulphur Springs, located just west of the Robertson-Sumner County boundary. Newspaper ads indicate that Robert B. Mitchell was running a commercial business there along the main road connecting Nashville to Lexington, Kentucky by 1850. Tennessee's second commercial springs came courtesy of the New Madrid earthquakes, which occurred between December 1811 and March 1812. There wasn't one, there wasn't two, there were 1,874 different earthquakes. It went on for like months. If we had one sitting here, we just wouldn't pay attention to it. Although they were centered in present-day southeastern Missouri, these earthquakes were felt strongly over 50,000 square miles in places such as Detroit, Michigan, Charleston, South Carolina. In the winter of 1811-1812, a neighbor of Andrew Jackson's named William Saunders noticed that one of the tremors had caused a crack in his land through which water poured. He quickly turned his spring into a commercial resort, calling it the Fountain of Health. For the next generation, his Fountain of Health remained one of the most consistent advertisers in the local newspaper. If you look at newspapers in Nashville from between like 1810 and 1835, the Fountain of Health has an ad in almost every newspaper. And Jackson would go there, and there's a couple of important meetings that took place there. Both Robertson Sulphur Springs and Saunders Fountain of Health faded in popularity and usage by around 1835. I believe that in both cases, the springs simply dried up, and that's what happens to most of these mineral springs. But by this time, both were eclipsed by two other springs that were close to Nashville. One was Carey Springs, I talked about that earlier, which was just across the county line from Robertson Springs in Sumner County. The other was called White's Creek Springs, which was about 10 miles north of Nashville. Although completely forgotten today, White Creek Springs may have been Middle Tennessee's longest active resort springs, since some version of it remained open until around 1910. You know where White's Creek High School is? If you go to White's Creek High School, there's a road that goes behind it, and if you go about 5 miles, it was there. And no one remembers it was there, but there is a place where there's like a gate on both sides of the road, and I think that was the gate that took you to the resort hotel. By 1840, the commercial springs craze had spread across the state, two in order of opening: Granger County's Lee Springs, Grundy County's Beersheba Springs, Blount County's Montvale Springs, Franklin County's Winchester Springs, and White County's Bon Air Springs. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about history of these hotels. In 1843, Tennessee Governor Jimmy Jones, whose nickname was Lean Jimmy, because he was the skinniest person to ever live, was feeling sickly and retreated to Bon Air Springs to drink the waters. Here's a story that says he's feeling sickly and going to retreat to drink the waters. Franklin and Armfield, an Arlington, Virginia-based company with branch offices all over the Southeast, may have bought and sold more human beings than any other business in American history. The largest slave trader in American history was a Tennessean. His name was Isaac Franklin. I've been fighting a 20-year battle to get him listed in the Social Studies standards. Franklin and Armfield bought enslaved people from plantations in Maryland and Virginia and transported them to slave trading centers in Natchez, Mississippi, and New Orleans, where they were sold for twice or 3 times what the firm paid for them. It was an incredibly profitable work and made both Isaac Franklin and John Armfield millionaires. In his retirement, Armfield invested time and money into rebuilding a resort hotel in the mountains of Tennessee called Beersheba Springs. He's the one that built it. Does anyone know Larry Papel? He's had me as a guest at his house, and his house was built by Armfield. So, does anyone know what Franklin's money went to build? Belmont, yeah. So, but this is an interesting way in which the resort culture interfered with history, or interacted with history. This is an interesting story. There were small resort hotels on top of Lookout Mountain overlooking Chattanooga. Some of them predated the Civil War, so you can imagine that the stupid battles interfered with their business. Dead people running all, anyway. People getting killed. Anyway, the Lookout Mountain House opened in the mid-1850s, but business was interrupted by the Civil War. In 1864, the hotel literally had a battle in its front yard, known in many parts of the country as the Battle Above the Clouds. When the resort hotel opened the next year, it used that to try to draw tourists. It said here, this is in 1866, we'll give tours from the hotel, including Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, blah, blah, blah. I guess of those early tours, you might accidentally find a dead body. It's like, oh, there's somebody, oh, what's that? You know. The Walnut Log Hotel in Obion County made national news in October 1908 when night riders dragged 2 Tennessee Land Company officers from their rooms and murdered one of them. The lynching proved to be the most famous event in what became known as the Reelfoot Lakes Night Rider Saga, which concerned the right of the general public to fish a lake even after a public company had bought up all the shoreline. A jury would later find men guilty of murder in connection with the incident, although their sentences were later overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court. Crime or not, the event resulted in an increasing public awareness of the public's right to use lakes. And that's why Reelfoot Lake became our first state park. In 1914, the state of Tennessee purchased Reelfoot Lake and most of its shoreline. A law was later passed declaring the lake public domain, which means people can fish there regardless of who owns the land around it. But anyway, the Walnut Log Hotel was on the front page of every newspaper in the country when this happened on October 24th, 1908. And I know at this point that some of you are tempted to raise your hand and say you remember this, but you don't. This happened in 1908. But I will tell you a funny, strange story. For some reason, one of these gentlemen had a child who was playing football for Vanderbilt. I think he was the one that survived that was missing. So the entire Vanderbilt football team got on a train and went up there and started looking for him. So, on July 9th, 1925, people on both sides of the famous Scopes trial visited the Morgan Springs Hotel in Ray County. William Jennings Bryan made a speech there. The trial would only last a few days, and Bryant's speech at the Morgan Springs Hotel turned out to be one of his last, maybe his last, depending on how you define the trial. He died 2 weeks later on July 26. But I thought it was interesting that they all went together to the hotel. And I don't know if you know anything about the Scopes trial, but it was more friendly than people are led to believe. It was, Darrow and Scopes were, patting each other on the backs. Ben W. Hooper, who was governor from 1911 until 1915, spent his youth hanging out at the Carson Springs Hotel, which is in Cocke County. In his retirement, he wrote a lot about the place and bemoaned the fact that the site was far better known for moonshiners than it was for good, clean fun. So in 1949, the former governor bought and donated some of the land on which the resort once sat to the Tennessee Baptist Convention, which still operates it as a conference center today. And if you look at, early Tennessee history, you'll see all these ads for the Carson Springs Hotel. This is one of the bigger ones, but not necessarily. It's probably maybe between 5 and 10 in terms of size. This was called the White Cliff Spring Hotel, and it was on top of a mountain in Monroe County. This is probably one of the ones that wasn't connected to a mineral spring. I don't think you had mineral springs on top of mountains. But by 1930, the White Cliff Spring Hotel in Monroe County had been closed for about 20 years. It was really active from like 1810 until from about 1880 until about 1910, and it closed. And this hotel was empty for 20 years. And there's a story that says, "It keeps watch with the ghost of yesteryear over the glory of its past," the Knoxville Journal reported in June of that year. "Only shadows play along its silent corridors where once gay maidens blithely tripped." 3 years later, the owner of the property bought it, or started tearing it down, because obviously it's going to burn down if you don't do something. He started tearing it down and running ads for people to come get it, like pay money to tear it down and take away banisters and this. Does anyone know what his name was? Harry Byrne. The most famous. Oh, is it on there? Okay. The most famous person from that. Does anyone know what he's famous for?
He gave women the right to vote with his vote.
Yeah, but I was a friend of mine who's the historian of McMinn County, and he's also the sheriff of McMinn County, which that doesn't happen very often. I asked him about this, and he said, "Oh yeah," but he says that almost no one knows about this. So Harry Byrne, the glorious Harry Byrne, who we all worship, tore down a beautiful hotel. I'm going to talk about hack rides. Does anyone know what hack ride refers to? Carriage buggy. Some of these resort hotels, especially the ones popular before 1840, were quite close to cities. White Creek Springs was close to Nashville. Raleigh Springs was close to Memphis. Whittle Springs, near Knoxville, it's now in Knoxville. And Lookout Mountain, just above Chattanooga. So accessing these hotels wasn't a problem. This is, by the way, is Whittle Springs Hotel, which was in what is now called Fountain City in Knoxville. Meanwhile, some resort hotels were located right along major roads. Tyree Springs, one of Tennessee's first commercial springs, was on the main road leading from Nashville to Lexington. Kingston Springs, which was a resort hotel, was just off the main stage road from Nashville to Memphis. Beersheba Springs and Bon Air Springs, although very remote, were located along major stagecoach routes. In the 1830s, the main road heading northeast from Knoxville to Virginia went through Rutledge, Rogersville, and Kingsport. One of the stops along the way was the Lee Springs Hotel, and that's the Lee Springs Hotel.
Is that related to Luke Lee?
Not at all.
His family?
Not at all. This predates him by like 100 years. But there's a story about the Lee Springs Hotel, and I think I'll talk about it later, because there's a city in Minnesota that is named for the owner of that hotel. And the interesting thing is that he fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. So if it was named for him in Tennessee, we'd have to rename it. But the people in Minnesota are fine with it. So anyway, the arrival of the railroad set the resort hotel era into its heyday. When the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad was being developed in the late 1840s and early 1850s, about a dozen resort hotels were built along its route in the area around Winchester. The same thing happened in every corner of Tennessee. In some cases, such as Henderson County's Henson Springs, Cheatham County's Craggy Hope, and Blount County's Kinzell Springs, resort hotels were built right on the railroad stop. Has anyone ever been to Townsend, Tennessee? Obviously. If you're driving along the highway, you drive right through this. They tore this down to build the highway. The railroad, there wasn't much of a road there. The railroad was kind of the main thing. When they replaced the railroad with the road, they took that out. After the Tennessee Central Railroad was built right through its property, I'm sorry, I skipped a sentence. In the 1840s, James B. Horn of Wilson County had a small series of resort cottages on his farm in Wilson County. After the Tennessee Central Railroad was built right through his property, he added a proper resort hotel on the site, and before long it was very popular among the elite in Middle Tennessee. Does anyone remember Horn Springs? Because that burned down. I don't know if you're old enough to remember Horn Springs, man.
I remember the stop on the railroad.
Yeah.
That's all.
Actually, it stayed a resort, and they had a pool and a dance hall. It was owned by Monk Russo.
But you don't want to burn down, right?
60s. Oh, I know, but they rebuilt several of the platforms
Yeah.
and kept it.
But you're not old enough,
No, I don't remember.
because it burned down in 1957.
I was born in 56.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't remember that on your own. And this is a beautiful picture. This is the Kensell Springs Hotel in what is now Townsend. And somebody turn it off. Okay. You know, I will say this. Can I, moment of levity? Has there ever been a meeting of this club where a phone hasn't gone off? I think so. I'm just glad it's not me. Anyway, this is the Kensell Springs Hotel in what is now Townsend. And, you know, my grandmother might be in there. She grew up in Knoxville and went to this hotel every so often. This is an ad that appeared in the Nashville newspaper in 1901. And you can see that the railroad, the big railroad in town, was very much linked, you know, publicity-wise with these hotels. It lists on here about 20 hotels: Mont Eagle, Lookout Mountain, Eastbrook Springs, Estill Springs, Beersheba Springs, Bonacqua Springs, Cascade Springs, Nicholson Springs, Beaver Dam Springs, Henson Springs, Horn Springs, Kingston Springs, Hurricane Springs, Fernvale Springs, Red Boiling Springs, McMinnville, Sewanee, Tullahoma, Montesano. I know where Montesano is. But I suspect that even the knowledgeable among us don't know exactly where all these hotels is. I looked it up and figured them out eventually, but like I said, Bill Lee owns what used to be Fernvale Springs, and he was shocked that anyone ever heard of it. It's his property. Yes, sir?
My wife's great-grandmother owned it before Bill Lee,
Oh, really? I see that, yeah.
and it burned down.
But like Bonacqua Springs was a really, really big deal, and it's a pretty place now, but it burned down like a long, long time ago. There's only a historic marker. However, many resorts were quite remote. Reaching them required the use of the hack, a method of transportation which evolved from mail delivery and which may need some explanation. Before the automobile, mail was delivered by horse or mule-led conveyances known as hacks. The mail hack might have been an enclosed carriage, a buggy, or a vehicle specifically made for the purpose of carrying letters and packages. These vehicles moved along the countryside at 5 or 6 miles per hour, stopping about every 2 hours to change horses. Passengers could ride mail hacks for a fee. In 1858, it cost $2 to ride the mail hack from Fayetteville to Shelbyville. In 1888, it cost $1 to ride the mail hack from Bolivar to Whiteville in Hardeman County. Between the Civil War and the 1820s, every resort hotel in Tennessee was either within walking distance of a train station or reachable by hack ride from the nearest depot. The Nicholson Springs Hotel ran hacks from the train station in the Warren County community of Smart. Every one of the half dozen or so hotels in Blount County, there were like 8 resort hotels in Blount County, had hack drivers who met guests at the train station in Maryville. To reach the many resort hotels in Red Boiling Springs, you took the train to Hartsville and met a hack there. Sometimes these hack rides lasted 20 minutes. Sometimes they took longer than that. Does anyone know where Pigeon Forge is? It's easy, okay. I just want to point that out because our great-great-grandparents had no earthly idea where it was. And here's why. Passengers and mail destined for Henderson Springs. The Henderson Springs Hotel was the first hotel that existed in what is now called Pigeon Forge. It was there a long, long time ago. Passengers and mail destined for Henderson Springs would be unloaded from the train in Knoxville, then lugged by mail hack to Sevierville, a 28-mile trip taking 3.5 hours. In Sevierville, passengers and mail would transfer to a different hack and taken on a 4-hour train journey passing Boyd's Creek, where the horses were changed, and Baker Springs, where the horses were changed again. If all went well, hack, mail, and worn-out passengers would arrive at Henderson Springs Resort at 9 p.m. So that's how long it took you from get to Knoxville to what is now called Pigeon Forge. And the biggest thing was the Henderson Springs Hotel. And the last time I went there, I found the historic marker and then drove around, and I found an old timer, and I asked him about it, and he looked at me like I was an alien. He said, "Oh my God, that place burned down in like 1963. How do you know about this?" I'm like, "No." Anyway, but almost no one there remembers this except this old timer. In the 1870s, now we're going to talk about Beersheba Springs. I expect many of you have been there, right? In the 1870s, passengers heading to Beersheba Springs left Nashville at 9:30 in the morning, heading southeast on the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway. At Tullahoma, they would transfer to the train heading northeast to McMinnville. At McMinnville, they would disembark and board a horse-drawn hack that would take them on the remaining 22 miles of their journey, past farms, through valleys, over creeks, and finally to the base of Cumberland Mountain. At the bottom of the mountain, the hack driver would ring a loud bell a certain number of times to let the folks on top of the mountain know how many passengers he had. Weather permitting and horses able, guests arrived in time for a late dinner. The hardest hotel to reach in Tennessee was on top of Roan Mountain on the Tennessee-North Carolina border. It was called Cloudland, and since Cloudland was 32 miles from the nearest train station, the journey to the hotel was quite the adventure. I'm going to leave this up for a second, and I'm going to tell you a story about that the Nashville Banner ran in 1880 about men who went to Cloudland and what happened along the way. On August 19th, 1880, the Nashville Banner recounted the adventures of two young men who had recently journeyed to Cloudland. First, the two men took the NC and St. Anna Railway to Chattanooga, then the Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia Railway to Johnson City, arriving at about 4:30 a.m. A few hours later, along with some fellow passengers from Georgia, they boarded a horse-drawn hack destined for Cloudland. 25 miles, 8 hours, and countless farmhouses later, the group reached the base of Roan Mountain, where they were still 7 miles from their destination. By that time, however, the road up the mountainside, the grade of which rose 1 foot in 10, was exceedingly muddy, and the fog was fast obscuring the mountain from their vision. The driver concluded to defer the ascent until tomorrow. Since there were no hotels in the remote location, the group separated, and the two young men from Nashville knocked on the door of a small house. The man who came to the door agreed to let them stay, but he explained that his wife was away at a religious camp meeting which lasted several days. He went and asked his female neighbor for help, and she came over and began cooking a dinner of ham and eggs. It was about this time that another horse-drawn hack arrived at the same house, this one heading from the top of the mountain to Johnson City. It carried 3 young ladies and 3 men, one of whom was the driver, and its passengers also needed shelter. The man agreed to let them stay, and the combined party, now numbering about 10, then proceeded to play several card games such as Old Maid and 7-Up. This sounds like something a Masterpiece Theater, okay? Sounds like All Creatures Great and Small. And then discussion turned to the sleeping arrangement. This is where it gets interesting. Since there were only 1 bedroom in the house with no less than 3 beds in it, after considerable fretting from the landlord and his neighbor, the women agreed to sleep in 2 of the beds, which were an upstairs bedroom, while the men moved the 3rd bed to the front porch where they slept. Then like the Darlin family. To make sure the women felt safe, one of the men loaned the woman a revolver for the night. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast, quote, good wishes and farewells were exchanged, and the two parties separated, sincerely hoping that a kind providence would at some time in the near future bring them again in contact, even if the meeting occurred in that humble home where scarcity of rooms and multiplicity of beds continued to lead a laughable situation. The travelers from Nashville then reboarded the Johnson City to Cloudland hack, which made the remaining 7 miles in only 5.5 hours. By the time they reached the hotel, they were tired but in good cheer. That was their journey to Cloudland. And in case you're wondering, one of the reasons Cloudland, probably the main reason it failed, is that it was so far off on its own. Imagine getting food and fuel up to it. It would have been a logistical disaster, even when they built other train stations that got them closer. But apparently at Cloudland, the building was built on the state line so that there would be ambiguity as to whether you were breaking the law. So if you were drinking illegally, you would get on this side and then switch to the other. So at least that's what the historic marker says. Now I'm going to talk about moms and pops. Okay. There were among the list of Tennessee resort hotels some that stayed in the same family for generations. They were self-financed, built one step at a time by people trying to eke out a living by tending to the needs of other people. Ethelrod Horn acquired land in Wilson County as part of an early 19th century land deal. His son, James Baker Horn, who lived from 1828 to 1893, found a mineral spring on the land around 1870. His son, James Adam, born 1861, died 1933, built a resort hotel on the site, which he ran his whole adult life and left to his son, Joseph Horn, who died in 1947. Just before his death, Joseph sold the Horn Springs Hotel to a dentist named R.D. Wilkerson. Wilkerson, quote, shot adrenaline into the place in the form of a renovation, according to a Tennessean story. But unfortunately, that renovation did not include a sprinkler system. So it burned down, like many of these hotels, and we'll talk about. But these are the ads you would see in the paper in the old days. Has anyone ever seen this building? I have, yeah. I think it's been torn down in the last few months.
That's still there.
Oh, really?
Last month it was still there.
Last month? Okay. Hickman County's Prim Springs Resort was run for nearly 100 years by 3 generations of the same family. Because of his claim that the mineral water saved his life, Daniel J. Estes organized the company that built the hotel there in 1870. As Estes grew old, it was run by his sons and then by 2 granddaughters, whose names were Miss Fanny and Miss Huella. They ran it practically by themselves through the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s. Fanny Bell Estes died at the age of 85, Hugh Ella at 97. If there are ghosts on this planet, there's one in that building. So, the sisters spent practically every day of their lives roaming the halls of the Prim Springs Hotel. And about a year ago, I was curious as to what became of it, and I just looked at the map and found Prim Springs Road and drove down it, and there it is. You don't encounter divorce very much when you research Tennessee history, but it does come up in the history of some of the state's resort hotels. Around 1894, a businessman named George Murray purchased the venerable Hale Springs Hotel and Springs near Rogersville, but not in Rogersville. This is confusing for people. In 1898, his wife, Sue, filed for divorce, and in the subsequent separation of assets, she ended up with the resort hotel. It was she who had to deal with the legal battle with the Virginia Fire and Insurance Company after the hotel burned down in 1902, and she who sold it, sold the 500-acre site to the International Printing Pressmen and Assistant Union of North America in 1909. This later became the site of what is known as Pressman's Home. Does anyone know about that? It's got a big article in there. But there was a resort hotel before Pressman's Home was there. And the organization built a self-contained retirement community called Pressman's Home on the old Hale Springs site, which remained there until 1969. There is currently a hotel in Rogersville called the Hale Springs Hotel. And it fell upon me to call them and explain to them that they're not as old as they think they are, because the original Hale Springs Hotel was here. And at some point, the owners bought another hotel in Rogersville and transferred the name. They weren't happy to hear this. But anyway, it's very clear. The most famous of the families who ran a small resort hotel in Tennessee were the Lees of Granger County. The Reverend Major Lee was a Revolutionary War veteran who experienced life in the Tennessee frontier when settlers were still fighting the Cherokee. Major, his name was Major, and Louisa lived in a house on Granger County known as Richland. They had several children, including sons Pryor, born in 1794, and Albert, born in 1808. Son Albert went to West Point and graduated 5th out of 33 cadets in 1831. Like so many West Point graduates of that era, Albert Lee became an engineer, which in those days meant he was also a surveyor and cartographer. He spent the first 5 years out of the academy posted at a place called Fort Des Moines. From there, he explored, surveyed, and mapped parts of Iowa and Minnesota, which is why there's a town called Albert Lee, Minnesota, in Minnesota. And the two people who came from there are Marion Ross, who was on Happy Days, and who is the senator from Minnesota?
Humphrey? Franken?
No, Franken. Franken came from here. In the early 21st century, a time when Confederate names were being taken off places all over the South, the city of Albert Lee, Minnesota clung to its name, even though he fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And I talked to the mayor of Albert Lee, and he said, "You're not going to write anything about this, are you?" Anyway, the house in which Albert Lee grew up in Granger County was torn down sometime between 2000 and 2008. It's gone now. So why did these hotels vanish? The first reason is because of automobiles. Around 1920, 1930, somewhere in there, people started getting cars, and the government started building better roads. Once people had automobiles and better roads, they had more choices than they had before. Better roads didn't necessarily come easy for a state with a lot of rivers and steep terrain. Before World War I, Tennessee's roads were either bad or non-existent on the Cumberland Plateau and mountains of East Tennessee. Then in 1914, automobile enthusiasts from the Midwest began lobbying for new roads, and they got state governments to commit to paving 2 north-south routes that became collectively known as the Dixie Highway. Anyway, the paving started and it got a lot of news. And here's, I talk more about the Dixie Highway than you want to know. But here's a map that shows the original Dixie Highway. There's Nashville. And, but there were 2 Dixie Highways. There was one here. I think this is, what highway is this now? 41. But there's also a Dixie Highway that came through East Tennessee, and they met in Chattanooga. So, but this is interesting. You know, I grew up going to Gatlinburg a lot because my grandmother lived in Gatlinburg. And I've always wanted, as I've learned more about Tennessee history, I've always wanted to know, when did Gatlinburg become big? Well, what happened is, in July of 1925, we had a governor named Austin Peay, and he started building roads. And there was an event that happened in the summer of 1925 in East Tennessee that put Tennessee in the headlines across the country. You know what that was? The Scopes Trial. Well, I talked to you about how remote Pigeon Forge was. Well, if Pigeon Forge was remote, Gatlinburg was impossible to get to. It was, unless you had a horse. And so it was hard to get to Gatlinburg, or what was then called Gatlinburg. And they decided they were going to pave the road between Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg, and they decided to move it up because of the Scopes Trial. They wanted all the important scientists, remember all these scientists that were going? And reporters and politicians to go to Gatlinburg because they knew that if they did, it would get a lot of publicity. And so so they moved Gatlinburg up on the list, this road. And I've looked this up on newspapers.com, Overnight, Gatlinburg went from being a difficult-to-reach, sleepy mountain town to a tourist mecca. The word Gatlinburg appeared only 10 times in Knoxville's 2 daily newspapers in the year 1923 combined. It appeared 20 times in 1924, 180 times in 1925, and 227 times in 1926. On August 8th, 1925, the Knoxville News Sentinel, or Knoxville Journal, had a story that said, Gatlinburg is now a suburb of Knoxville. And but that's what it looked like, okay? And as Gatlinburg had no known mineral springs, but that didn't seem to bother anyone. The town had 2 hotels, those being the Mountain View Hotel and the Riverside Hotel. Both were expanded to meet the demand brought on by the improved highway. In some ways, these hotels reflected the culture and lifestyle of the old-style resorts. The rooms still had porches and rocking chairs, and of course, no air conditioning. Dinners were served family style. When state legislators came through on a sightseeing trip in 1927, they sat down at big tables at the Mountain View Hotel and consumed a meal of fried chicken, boiled ham, creamed potatoes, and fresh but overcooked vegetables as guests at resort hotels had done for generations. And this is one of the hotels that was built in Gatlinburg in this era, and I think this was still standing when I was a child. I think this is the one they took down to build the aquarium. And this is what Gatlinburg looked like when I was a child. However, these hotels had something that no Tennessee resort hotel had ever had before, a full parking lot. Only a few years earlier, people didn't have cars. To get to resort hotel, Tennesseans took the train to the nearest station, then rode a slow horse-drawn hack for hours. Now people had cars and could go where they wanted, and suddenly the train and hack were a thing of the past. So through the 1920s and 1930s, it was not uncommon for sightseers to drive the loop road through Maryville, Townsend, the Smokies, Gatlinburg, and Pigeon Forge, spending money at family-owned resort hotels to eat dinner or hear music along the way. In addition to the new Gatlinburg hotels, these stops included Chilhowie Inn in Wallen, Kinsell Springs in Townsend, Line Springs Hotel in Wares Valley, the Wonderland Hotel near Elkmont. Anyone remember going there? My grandmother took me there when I was a kid. Tallahassee Springs along the Little Tennessee River, and Henderson Springs near Pigeon Forge. The new national park, Great Smoky Mountains, had opened around 1925, depending on how you view the opening date. But that was obviously the main driving force, but without better roads, this wouldn't have happened. The moment people from Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Nashville got in their cars and drove the roads around the Smokies, old resorts such as Tate Springs and Beersheba Springs noticed that their business was falling off. These hotels didn't announce this, of course, or complain about it to reporters, but one way you can tell is by the size and frequency of the ads. Mineral Springs resort hotels, which purchased big ads before 1925, were much more likely to settle for classified ads by the 1930s. Sumner County's Tyree Springs Hotel, for instance, advertised heavily from 1880 until the mid-1920s. 1926 was the last time Tyree Springs bought an ad other than a small classified one. Meanwhile, the list of resort hotels that appear to have closed in the 1920s was a long one. So the automobile, I think, is the main reason that these hotels vanished, but I will cite 3 others. First of all, by the early 20th century, medical science and the quality of tap water had improved to the point where people no longer believed in the healing power of mineral water. There was a time when people thought if you're sick, you need to go to a Mineral Springs Hotel and stay there for a month and drink the water. What we see from that point onward, from the 1920s, is a focus on other amenities of the resorts, such as golf, tennis, croquet, bowling, dancing, and of course, good food. More than a dozen of Tennessee's resort hotels claimed to serve the best fried chicken in the state in the 1920s. Everyone can't serve the best fried chicken, but everyone's claimed to. But eventually, people realized that an establishment didn't have to be a hotel to serve good fried chicken. I think Harlan Sanders was the first one to figure this out. Restaurants could serve fried chicken as well. But I do remember like going to a couple of these hotels when I was a kid that were still around, and that's what you did. You ate the fried chicken, but we didn't stay in the hotel. Meanwhile, as if on cue, many of the mineral springs themselves were vanishing. In the 1940s, a Vanderbilt professor and a geologist named George Mayfield wrote a semi-regular column for the Nashville Banner about the outdoors. Can you imagine a world in which Vanderbilt professors write columns for the newspaper? This is, yeah, I can't imagine them even lowering themselves to do this in my life. But anyway, a professor named George Mayfield, some of you may have met him. There were dorms named for him when I was there. He wrote a column for the Nashville Banner about fishing and outdoors, but he wrote one about this. And in 1948, he devoted an entire column to the decline of spring resorts and pointed out that many of their springs had simply dried up. He says, in most cases, the waters are now but a trickle as compared to 50 years ago, which raises the question of why. I don't know. There's two possibilities. One is climate change. The other is that the earthquake is what created a lot of these in the first place. And as we got further away from the earthquake, they ceased to exist. But, you know, almost all these places, you'll say, where's the springs? You know, we don't know. If a fourth reason was necessary, one cannot help but contemplate the development of state parks. By the mid-1930s, Tennessee already had state parks, those being Reelfoot Lake, Cumberland Mountain, Pickett, and Montgomery Bell. The Civilian Conservation Corps built roads, dams, cabins, and trails at these structures in 1937, which is right about the time the state formed an Office of State Parks. As these new state parks developed amenities, the list looked similar to the old ones being offered by the old resort hotels. Cottages, the outdoors, hiking, recreation, restaurants, and pavilions. In 1955, the Tennesseans, Ralph Morrissey, what happens is at some point you start seeing all these articles about whatever happened to these beautiful resort hotels. And they started earlier than you might think. In 1955, the Tennesseans, Ralph Morrissey, wrote that, quote, though a few Middle Tennessee resorts are still operating, most have either vanished entirely or survive as ghost towns with only a few dilapidated cabins or ruined hotels still standing. There were several stories about the decline of Prim Springs hotels over the years. In 1984, a Tennessean reporter named Tommy Goldsmith asked a resident of the Craggy Hope community of Cheatham. There was a Craggy Hope hotel in Cheatham County, which is a resort mineral springs hotel, why the resort hotel there declined. She said, the auto didn't end, said Georgia Trainer, echoing the assessment of countless other observers. She said, it lasted until they got better roads and cars and they took the train off. So what became of these old hotel buildings? And the answer is, in many cases, they burned out. This one's still standing. This is this is not Beersheba. This is, it looks similar to Beersheba, but this is one of the ones in Red Boiling Springs. I think this is called the Donahoe. Yeah. So what became of these hotel buildings? First of all, 3 of them are still open in Red Boiling Springs. Yes, there are 3 hotels in Macon County which have been in somewhat continuous operation throughout the 20th century, and they all reflect more of the lifestyle of the early 20th century than they do the 21st. One of them, the Donahoe House, is entirely made of lumber and is fronted by a long porch like almost all hotels would have been in the 19th century. A second hotel called Armour's still does hot mineral baths. They mix tap water with mineral water so you can get a mineral bath experience. A third, the Thomas House, claims to be haunted, and there have been like 20 cable shows done of the ghost in the Thomas House. And if you don't think it's haunted, don't tell that to the owner because he'll go on and on about it. It's definitely haunted. Anyway, at least 2 of the resort hotels of yesteryear, Kingston Springs and Unaka Springs, are still standing but are used as private residences. This is the one in Kingston Springs, which some of you may have seen. 2 others, the Wonderland Hotel in Sevier County and the Prim Springs Hotel in Hickman County, are still standing but abandoned. Actually, I'm wrong about that. The Wonderland Hotel has now been taken down by the National Park Service like 2 years ago. Since the Wonderland Hotel is in the heavily trafficked Elkmont section of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, it may be the most photographed abandoned hotel in America. Not anymore. The Prim Springs Hotel, on the other hand, is unknown even to many of the residents of that section of Hickman County. I have met people who say that they're from Prim Springs who didn't know this exists. You can find it by heading down the unpaved and hard-to-find road named for the hotel. At least three old resort hotels became church camps or conference centers. The Tennessee Conference of the Methodist Church bought Beersheba Springs in 1941, and that is why Beersheba Springs is by far the best preserved and the best documented of any of these hotels. There's like books about it. Meanwhile, the former resort sites at Beaver Dam Springs in Hickman County, Crystal Springs in Lincoln County, and Carson Springs in Cocke County are also church camps. However, little or nothing is left of any of the former resorts at any of these locations. As for the many other former resort hotels, the most common fate is that they burn down. The biggest resort hotel fire in Tennessee history were the Lookout Mountain Inn in 1908. There's three of them. The Lookout Inn in 1908, the Oliver Springs Hotel in 1905, and the Tate Springs Hotel in 1963. The Montvale Springs Hotel burned down twice, the original in 1896 and the larger hotel built in its place in 1933. Hamilton County's Cliffs Hotel burned down in 1904 and again in 1908. The Henson Springs Hotel in Henderson County burned in 1882 and in 1896 and then in 1913. It burned down 3 times. There were 2 resort hotels in Robertson County, the Hygeia Springs Hotel and the Villa Crest Hotel. Both burned down within weeks of each other in 1928. Here is fires that I've been able to document in the newspaper. This is not a complete list. This is just the ones I found. But I think the ones that I have bold are the big ones. Anyway, in case you're wondering what caused these fires, fireplace heating and faulty flues were obviously a cause of many of these fires. I do want to point out the resort hotels were among the first buildings in the state to be wired for electricity, which is part of the appeal of visiting them. However, that's a good thing and a bad thing. The good news is we have electricity. The bad thing is we're the first to get electricity, so our wiring is really dangerous. Have you ever renovated a house and replaced the electrical system and the guy says, I can't believe you've been living in this house. This is a fire trap. These were all fire traps.
Some of them arson.
Yeah, it is also in the realm of possibility that arson was the cause of some of these fires. In the old days, when you see that a hotel will be burned down in fire, it would immediately say how much insurance the guy had. So, and this is the Horn Springs Hotel burning down in 1949. TVA flooded the sites of at least half a dozen of these hotels. A popular watering resort as early as the 1850s, Ray Springs was inundated by the waters of Watts Bar Lake in 1939. Also, here's a story that says, destroyed 2 times by fire, the Ray Springs Hotel opened last Saturday for one of its last seasons before flood waters will cover it. The lake from Watts Bar Dam will cover the lawn to a depth of 14 feet. Giles County's Elkmont Springs Hotel was destroyed by a tornado on April 1st, 1933. And this is my favorite of all. On July 17th, 1933, the Benton Springs Hotel in Polk County tumbled down a cliff. Must have been fun to see. You're driving along and all of a sudden a hotel building falls on you. But 3 roads were barked by the debris in parts of the old 42-room building were scattered over a section of several hundred yards. Just why the old building turned all holds loose is a matter of mystery, but that it no longer stands at the site of the once popular pleasure resort is a matter of fact. People don't write like that anymore. Hardeman County's Rogers Springs Hotel, this was one of the few in West Tennessee, was struck by lightning, then burned down in 1984. As for the real estate, the plots of land where these old resort hotels, pavilions, springs, and walkways used to be, the vast majority of them are completely abandoned and forgotten and have been so for many years. Does anyone know what the original county seat of Shelby County was? It wasn't Memphis. It was called Raleigh. The main thing in Raleigh was this enormous hotel. It was called the Raleigh Springs Hotel. But this is one of the ads for it, and it's a huge building. Nature has taken over the former site of the Raleigh Springs Hotel since the grand old building burned in 1912. But I found a man who's a former state representative named Tim Joyce, and he took my sons and I through the place on an early December day, a year and a half ago. He took me to where the hotel had been. Beneath the recently fallen leaves, we found some old bricks and some rusty pipes. We found a rusty metal awning which had once been the shelter for the trickle of water that had previously been known as Umbrella Spring, and that was it. But the building was gone, and the mineral spring no longer runs. And that's in the largest population-wise county in the state. Tennessee's old resort hotels of yesteryear have been gone for so long that generations of journalists have bemoaned how they left nothing behind. In 1987, the Tennessean reported that Tyree Springs is today only a historic marker. Even the ruins of the once impressive hotel and support buildings are gone. It has been reclaimed by the underbrush and wildlife from which its founders carved it. In 1953, a Tennessean reporter went in search of Sam's Creek Springs in Cheatham County. The old dirt road was so overgrown with weeds and underbrush that they never got to the actual site. This was 1953, so good luck looking for it today. 5 years before that, a Knoxville Journal columnist wrote an article pointing out that the former site of the Glen Alpine Springs Hotel was gone, and people weren't even sure then, and that was 1948, exactly where it had been. If you're looking for the oldest tombstone of a resort hotel in Tennessee, you might go looking for Bon Air Springs. Once one of Tennessee's most glorious resort hotels, Bon Air peaked before the Civil War when its remoteness on the Cumberland Plateau kept out the riffraff. People came all the way from Louisiana to visit it, the Nashville Banner reported. However, the Banner went on to say, sadly, that the days of the Bon Air were gone, so gone, in fact, that there was practically nothing left of it. They had the coolest mountain home, the best mineral water, and the most delightful scenery to be found anywhere. However, the big hotel is gone, having been burned by soldiers during the war. Only a tall stone chimney and some piles of moss-grown rocks remain to mark its place. What's striking about this article is not what it says, but when it came out. This is an article about we've lost the Bon Air Springs Hotel. It actually came out in 1890. So in 1890, they couldn't remember where this hotel had been. So, we've seen like 20 articles since then in what used to be newspapers that indicate the same thing. So if you know where any of these resort hotels are, you let us know. I think that's it.
Bill, what about Mont Eagle Sunday School Assemblies? Would that be on your list?
There was a mountainside hotel in Mont Eagle that fit my category. I think it was called the Mont Eagle Inn.
It's called the Eagle Hotel, wasn't it?
The big one was called the Mont Eagle Inn.
That was in the grounds of the assembly, wasn't it? But there was a hotel on the highway 40, is it 41?
I think this predates all that. But there was a hotel there called the Mont Eagle Inn, and I talk about it in the,
Is it the assembly Inn?
no. Okay. I don't know, but I think anything that you guys might know about, I'm talking about things that were gone by like 1920. The Mont Eagle Inn, I have pictures of it here somewhere.
The one that's burned in
Okay, in 1950, the Monteagle Hotel burned for a third time. It burned 2 or 3 other times before then.
Were any of the springs in Tennessee thermal springs?
Hot springs? The answer is no, but if you go to Hot Springs,
Arkansas.
yeah, Hot Springs. Yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know what they say thermal springs pull over, and I went over and I'm like, ah. They have hot springs in Arkansas. And by the way, that's one of the reasons that there were less mineral springs in West Tennessee than there were in East Tennessee, in Middle Tennessee, because everybody in West Tennessee would go to hot springs.
What'd your grandmother do in Gatlinburg?
My grandmother was widowed in 1965, and she grew up in Knoxville. She had I think she had experienced some of this in the 20s, and so she moved as a retired person to Gatlinburg, and she lived in a $100 a month apartment. And we visited her. She's within walking distance of the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. And I lived 2 summers with her and worked on the Parkway because you didn't have to have a car to work in Gatlinburg. So anyway, yes, sir.
And then when you were mentioning the recreational things they could do, you didn't mention swimming. Did any of these places, at least in their later years, have pools, or did they have? Did any of the places have? Any of the springs have areas where you could swim, or they advertise you could swim?
I think, you know how, you ever gone out to the Harpeth and just waded in the river and thrown rocks? You know, that's what people did. But there were, much later, starting in the 1930s, that you might have places that will build swimming pools. There is a swimming pool in front of the haunted hotel in Macon County, and I asked them how long it's been since that was active, and they said sometime in the early 1980s. So,
Another thing, you mentioned Hot Springs, Arkansas. Do any of these places have gambling or any kind of vice?
I don't know about gambling, but I do know that it was funny how you would see moonshine busts near them, and especially as they declined. So, and also there was a bunch of them in the area of what is now Winchester and Tullahoma. You know, I don't think about that as a heavy touristy area, but there were 8 Mineral Springs hotels there. And one of them is where there is now a distillery called the Cascade Distillery. And I did call and ask them about it, and the person who answered the phone had no earthly idea what I was asking about.
Yeah.
This is
George Dickel.
Yeah, Tullahoma, Georgia.
is it called Cascade or?
Yep.
Yeah. There was not, yes ma'am, yes sir.
One of the earlier ads talked about the prime season being what looked like wintertime, and another one talked about the prime season being summertime. Were there 2 different kinds of resorts?
I don't know. Never thought of that. That's never, I didn't notice that. Yes ma'am.
I used to romp around Prairie Springs back in the 70s, and there were a lot of buildings there at the time. There was even furniture still there. There was a big bandstand, where they had dances.
Yeah.
Open air place, and in the hotel, they had holes cut out for privy that was over the stream.
Really?
Yes.
And the people are swimming downstream. You know, there is a Facebook page that I don't necessarily recommend called History of Tennessee. I don't recommend it. You have better things to do with your time, but I get drawn in sometimes. There was somebody put a picture of the Lookout Inn, and the Lookout Inn was maybe the largest of them all. Apparently there were 8 family-run hotels on top of Lookout Mountain, and then these investors got involved in New York, and they built a 450-room hotel, 400-room hotel on top of Lookout Mountain, and that's why the incline was built, and it took you right to it, and it was so badly thought out. If you look in the newspapers, you can see that people aren't being paid. the water department's not being paid, the construction workers aren't being paid. It went bankrupt, and then they brought it back and went bankrupt again. And finally, it magically burned down 18 years later. But for a while, it was the largest thing, and you can imagine the sight of it on fire. But the other thing is, by building it there, they destroyed most of the other small family-owned businesses that were already up there. So it's best not to get sentimental about it. But if you see the picture of it now, you're like, oh my gosh. And now there's houses on top of Lookout Mountain. But before there was just hotels. I didn't know this, so.
Was there a hotel at Ridgetop? I know there were a lot of summer houses up there.
Oh, you mean in Sumner County?
Robert.
Yeah,
County.
there was. I don't remember them off the top of my head. But the answer is yes.
Yeah, just north of Villa.
Okay, Robertson County. It was called the Villa Crest Hotel? I think it was called the Villa Crest Hotel. But yes, I went up there and. Is that it? Yes, sir.
Bill, could you get a sense from your research of where most Nashvillians would have gone? I mean, from a traffic standpoint, where did they,
Well, one of the things I don't know is like whether only rich people did this or whether middle-class people did this. I don't know. I also don't understand, because I've looked in the black-owned newspapers, and there are actually references of black people going to Beersheba Springs. And I don't quite understand that, because maybe they had different buildings or something, but it was against the law. So, but I don't know the answer to that one. I do know that I've been trying to figure out what I'm doing with all this information, but because I clearly thought I was doing a book, but I can't find a publisher that will want to touch it. So, yes, ma'am.
Well, I was just gonna mention that my grandparents on both sides of my family were not wealthy. They, they made a decent living, but they went to the spring. My mother's family went up to Red Boiling Springs. My dad's mother told me she went to Spring Springs.
Yeah.
So,
One question.
My grandmother used to, and they were not, they were middle class, but certainly not upper class. And she used to talk about going to Red Boiling Springs and sitting on the porch and rocking. So long before Cracker Barrel came along, that was my idea of what old people did.
Yeah.
Is that they sat on a porch and rocked in a rocking chair.
But I will say that if you want to do this, go to Red Boiling Springs, stay at the Donahoe. There's 3 hotels. One of them is better than the other 2. But there's one that's been run by a young married couple from, Yeah, the brick one. But they have good food, but I do want to point out that you need to bring a book. It's, after we pulled out, after being there 2 days, I jokingly said to my wife that if I had been brought here as a kid, I would call it Red Boring Springs.